Welcome to another session of the Code Dance series. Today we'll be talking about input and output statements. And when we talk about inputs, an input is any kind of data that is fed into the computer by a user. And the user does this by making use of a device we usually refer to as the input devices. So it can be textual data, can be a video, it can be graphic, anything at all. It can even be sound. Now, when the user gives the computer program his input, the user usually expects what we call an output. So the computer program's response to the user is what we refer to as an output. So an output is anything that comes out in the form of any kind of data at all to the user is known as an output. So it can be just a single line or a statement. It can be a picture, it can be a video. That is basically an output. Now, the computer has a way of showing an output to the user, and that is what that actually happens with the use of an output device. And the monitor is an example of it. And during a computer program execution, two things usually happen. We first have the computer showing the user a prompt, and then the user will now respond with an input. Based on the inputs, the computer will further respond with output. So basically, the user interacts with the computer program with its inputs after seeing some prompts, and then basically the PC responds with an output. Now, during the execution of a program, the computer expects the user to interact with the program with his input. Now, as I said earlier, during the previous video, we talked about variables, and with variables, when the input of a user is gotten, it is stored inside a container, and that container is what we refer to as a variable. So the example that I used in the previous videos was when I see a person, I store the name of the person in a container, and then I have an image of the person as the label of the container. So anytime I see a person, the picture on the container helps me to recognize the name inside the container. So in the same way, when we want to take an item or data from the user, we'll store it inside a variable, which in this particular series I refer to as a container. So if it is the name of a particular user that you want to store in a container, around the container, which is basically the label, we will have the variable name over there, and then inside the container we will have the actual thing that we are storing. So think of a container with the label name, and then inside the container we have a name like Sandra. All right. Now, with respect to an output, the computer will usually display what we call prompts to a user in order to inform them to feed the program with some details or figures or some kind of input data. And then in responding to the inputs that the user gave, the computer will now display what we call as display messages, output, or even results of computation. Now, there are some verbs that in this particular series we'll be taking a look at. In a specific programming language, they'll be making use of words like scan, see in, and all of that, depending on the programming language you are using. But because in this series we are not paying particular attention to any specific programming language, we are dealing with what we call a pseudocode, which is basically a plain English form of writing a computer program. So instead of following specific grammars or grammar in a specific language, we are going to be using words like input, get, take, and so forth. Now, with an output statement, we will also be making use of commands as listed below: output, put, show, and display. In the next slide, we'll take a look at how to use them. Now, this is going to be the last slide talking about input and output statements. Now, because I made mention of the fact that when you are taking an input from the user, you will be using commands like the input verbs we talked about in the previous slide, and then a variable name. So in this case, we have the input command and then the name, which is a variable. So this means that the computer, whenever it is trying to execute this statement, when it comes across this line, the keyboard will now be ready to feed in data into this variable. And there are a lot of things that go on underneath, so I wouldn't want us to concern ourselves with the specifics. Now, in the same way, if you want to take in data into a variable like age, we can write get age, and when the computer is trying to execute statements, when it comes across this particular command, it will know that you want to collect the age from the keyboard into this particular variable. Now, for output statement, you will basically be concerned, it's basically concerned with using an output command like the output verbs we talked about, especially if we are writing a pseudocode, and then a particular kind of data. So if it's a string you want to display, if it's a character you want to display, you just bring your output command. It can be the put, can be the show, or anything at all, and then you now follow it with the kind of data you want to display. One thing we need to take note of is that when a computer program is executing, it does so line after line. So while you are trying to output something onto the screen, until it is done writing a whole line, it will not move to the next line unless you explicitly inform it to do so. This is where we'll end today's lesson. Stay tuned for the next one. Do well to follow us on all our social media platforms.